There are specific moments in life that seem ordinary on the surface, yet carry a massive, profound weight underneath them. You cross paths with a person, casually exchange a few words, seamlessly move through the routines of your daily life, and logically assume nothing unusual is happening. But beneath visible reality, massive, undeniable emotions begin violently forming in places that no one can see. Sometimes, a specific human being casually enters your physical orbit and instantly experiences a profound psychological phenomenon they absolutely cannot logically explain. They physically feel an ancient, haunting familiarity with your exact energy long before they ever truly, deeply know your history. They acutely notice the heavy weight of your presence completely differently from absolutely everyone else standing in the crowded room. They flawlessly remember incredibly small, seemingly insignificant details about your existence, obsessively revisit mundane conversations in the complete silence of their own mind, and heavily carry profound emotions they absolutely never logically intended to feel. What your conscious mind never truly realizes is that exactly while you effortlessly continue living your ordinary life, someone has quietly, desperately been carrying a massive, bleeding truth inside their core since the exact, precise day they first met you. Carl Jung deeply believed that human beings are absolutely not guided exclusively by logical, conscious decisions, but are massively driven by powerful, ancient forces hidden entirely in the dark architecture of the unconscious mind. According to his profound clinical perspective, individuals are incredibly often violently drawn towards specific others, precisely because those specific individuals effortlessly awaken completely forgotten, dormant parts of their own psyche. Certain incredibly rare connections physically feel immediate and overwhelming exactly because they bypass the ego and directly touch something ancient and unhealed within our core. Jung clinically described this magnificent phenomenon absolutely not as simple biological attraction, but as a massive structural meeting between two entirely separate inner worlds. When a human being feels instantly, deeply connected to your specific frequency from the absolute beginning, it may absolutely not be because they logically understand every single intricate detail about your surface identity. Instead, something primal and ancient inside their subconscious instantly recognizes profound possibility, deep cosmic meaning, unparalleled comfort, or terrifying, irreversible psychological transformation. That is precisely why some heavily guarded individuals forcefully remain dead, silent for an agonizingly long period of time. Profound, earth-shattering love is absolutely not always expressed quickly or cleanly. Very frequently, the internal emotions become so incredibly massive, so completely overwhelming to their traumatized nervous system, that the individual physically experiencing them becomes utterly paralyzed by the terrifying fear of permanently changing the fragile dynamic that already safely exists. They sit alone in the dark and endlessly, obsessively wonder whether verbally speaking their heavy truth would completely, violently destroy the beautiful connection they currently rely on for their baseline sanity. They aggressively question their own mental stability, wondering whether their profound feelings are undeniably real or simply a desperate, synthetic product of their own unhealed imagination. So, they cowardly choose to remain safely in your physical proximity while carrying an invisible, suffocating emotional burden. They smile completely normally. They carefully measure every single syllable they speak, and they masterfully hide their fiercely beating heart directly behind the camouflage of ordinary, casual conversations. Yet, internally, behind the flawless mask, every single microscopic interaction with you matters infinitely more than your logical mind could ever possibly comprehend. Jung deeply understood that human beings construct a persona, a highly curated, heavily armored version of themselves they safely present to the external world to avoid rejection and maintain control. But underneath this thick, synthetic armor exists the true, bleeding self, housing all the raw emotions, desperate desires, and profound truths the ego is utterly terrified to expose. To fully admit love is to completely surrender the persona. It requires stepping out of the safe fortress of emotional neutrality and brutally admitting that another human being has become massively, critically important to their survival. For an individual who heavily relies on logic and distance to protect themselves, this vulnerability feels exactly like standing on the jagged edge of a massive cliff entirely without a parachute. They falsely convince their racing mind that keeping their profound feelings permanently hidden is significantly safer than risking the agonizing pain of potential disappointment. So, they continue playing the part perfectly. They casually answer your messages, they maintain the appropriate physical distance, and they act entirely unbothered, while internally, a violent, chaotic psychological storm rages absolutely every time your name flashes on their screen. But chronological time possesses a highly unique, ruthless way of violently exposing exactly what is real. Massive emotions that are deeply rooted in the architecture of the soul absolutely do not peacefully disappear simply because they remain unspoken. Instead, they actively evolve. They mutate. They aggressively dig their roots infinitely deeper into the subconscious. Days seamlessly turn into weeks, weeks bleed into months, and perhaps even agonizing years pass in this silent purgatory. But exactly because the connection was never built on cheap, temporary impulse or shallow physical excitement, it simply refuses to die. Every single shared memory becomes a heavily guarded treasure. They quietly, obsessively celebrate your hard-earned successes from the shadows. They feel a sharp, visceral physical pain exactly when you are struggling. They notice your profound internal growth in ways absolutely no one else does. And they execute all of this completely in silence, absolutely not because they are waiting for a transactional reward, but entirely because true, deep affection fundamentally, permanently alters exactly how human attention biologically operates. You have completely hijacked their focus. Jung also spoke extensively regarding the concept of projection, the psychological tendency to inadvertently place hidden, unacknowledged parts of our own psyche directly onto another individual. In the very beginning of this dynamic, they may have logically tried to convince their ego that they were simply attracted to an idealized fantasy image of you. But with the unstoppable passage of time, because the profound feeling was undeniably genuine, the cheap illusion completely faded away, and something infinitely, vastly deeper remained in the wreckage. They actively began seeing the real, unvarnished, authentic you, flaws, complexities, uncertainties, and all. And terrifyingly, the massive feeling became exponentially stronger instead of weaker. That is exactly the precise coordinate where true, unbreakable affection originates. The unconscious mind absolutely does not speak in direct, logical sentences. It screams through recurring, intrusive thoughts, through highly meaningful synchronicities, through vivid dreams, and through heavy, gravitational feelings that violently refuse to be rationalized away. Slowly, brutally, they realize their intense attention toward you is absolutely no longer casual, and it never truly was. This brings us to one of Jung's absolute most critical concepts: individuation. The agonizing, beautiful psychological process of becoming fully brutally aware of exactly who we truly are. During this massive internal transformation, an individual eventually reaches a critical breaking point where they can absolutely no longer tolerate living according to the dictates of fear. They are violently pulled toward radical authenticity. A hidden, long-suppressed love confession almost always organically appears at exactly that precise moment. The individual suddenly, violently realizes that they absolutely can no longer deny what has undeniably been the absolute truth all along. They clearly, structurally understand that the crushing weight of their silence has finally become vastly heavier than the terrifying risk of raw honesty. The massive emotions they spent years perfectly, clinically controlling begin aggressively kicking down the doors of their conscious mind, loudly demanding to be fully acknowledged in the light. Perhaps this specific individual has obsessively replayed your very first meeting entirely in their mind thousands of times. Perhaps they flawlessly remember the exact clothing you were wearing, the precise cadence of your voice, or incredibly small, seemingly meaningless details that you completely forgot about years ago. Maybe they have quietly, faithfully watched your magnificent growth from the freezing distance and deeply admired beautiful things about your spirit that they never possessed the raw courage to say aloud. They did absolutely not do this because they arrogantly expected anything in return, but entirely because something about your sheer existence became the most meaningful, defining anchor in their entire timeline. Jung firmly believed that highly meaningful encounters are absolutely rarely cosmic accidents. Certain rare individuals actively arrive in our orbit, absolutely not to neatly complete us, but to violently, beautifully rip us open and explicitly reveal the deepest, most terrified parts of our own unhealed souls. And right now, in this exact coordinate of reality, something massive is shifting. The profound, heavy emotions that have been expertly hidden entirely beneath the calm, sterile surface of ordinary conversations are finally preparing to violently breach the surface. Absolutely, not because chronological time arbitrarily forced them to, but entirely because absolute truth inevitably, mathematically demands to be spoken. Someone who once fiercely, stubbornly kept their physical and emotional distance is actively preparing to completely drop the heavy armor and show you unvarnished honesty. Someone who spent a massive percentage of their life ruthlessly protecting their fragile feelings is finally beautifully choosing the path of absolute courage. The psychological pressure of keeping you a secret from the world and from you has completely exhausted their nervous system. The terrifying realization that they could permanently lose you to someone who is actually brave enough to claim your frequency has finally overridden their primal fear of rejection. If that massive, cinematic moment actually arrives in your reality, you must deeply remember this clinical truth. Being profoundly loved from the absolute beginning does not always mean grand, theatrical gestures or perfectly synchronized timing. Very frequently, it means that a deeply traumatized, highly guarded human being carried profound respect, deep admiration, and massive, silent affection entirely through dark seasons of crippling uncertainty until they finally, painstakingly found the necessary internal strength to explicitly reveal it to you. And perhaps the absolute greatest, most beautiful mystery of this entire dynamic is absolutely not that they deeply loved you since the exact second they met you, but that they finally, miraculously became brave enough to look you dead in the eyes and admit it. Love incredibly often begins in the absolute, freezing silence long before spoken vocabulary ever appears. And that specific silence is absolutely rarely empty. It is filled to the absolute brim with hyper-vigilant observations, heavily guarded emotions, terrifying unanswered questions, and fleeting moments that seem entirely ordinary to the rest of the world, but become entirely, permanently unforgettable to the specific person actively experiencing them. This journey was absolutely never only about someone simply falling in love. It was deeply about profound soul recognition, internal psychological conflict, primal fear, massive self-discovery, and, finally, the ultimate courage to become entirely, ruthlessly, emotionally honest. The heavily hidden admiration, the quiet, unbroken attention, the vivid memories that stubbornly stayed, and the profound feelings that successfully survived agonizing uncertainty, all point directly toward one unshakable, absolute truth. Exactly what is genuinely, fundamentally real on the inside eventually, violently seeks expression on the outside. And perhaps that is the ultimate profound message at the absolute core of this entire story. A specific human being who has loved you incredibly quietly from the shadows is absolutely, not suddenly revealing a brand new, fleeting feeling. They are actively, finally revealing a massive, structural truth they have heavily, silently carried since the very beginning of your timeline. Because deep, authentic love, in the Jungian psychological understanding, is absolutely not simply about finding another physical person to ease your loneliness. It is entirely about brutally discovering the unhealed, magnificent parts of your own self completely through a profound connection that your soul could absolutely no longer ignore. And exactly when the heavy veil of fear finally steps aside, absolute truth speaks. And exactly what remained locked away and hidden in the dark for so incredibly long finally, beautifully becomes undeniably visible in the light. If this profound breakdown provided the exact validation your intuition has been fiercely seeking in the dark, I want you to go down to the comments right now and explicitly declare your sovereignty. Type, "I am ready for absolute truth." Claim that unshakable, pristine energy entirely for your own resilient spirit. Then, please click the video appearing right here on your screen. It perfectly reveals the exact psychological boundaries you must establish to permanently protect your sovereign peace moving forward when this truth finally arrives. Stay grounded, honor your worth, and keep moving forward.